hello. Welcome to Acadian Driftwood, where Kendall and I are actually in the same room right now. How's it going, man? What's up?
Pretty good.
All right.
Yeah, we're both ended up in the same town for Super Bowl Sunday, so we decided it'd be kind of fun to do a podcast together in the same room with the same webcam. So
Yep. So we put together a quick little a messy little podcast studio in my living room with a bunch of makeshift lights and everything, trying to make this thing work. And I think it worked out a little bit. And we got our coffee, and we're just kind of thought we'd do this before we both head to a Super Bowl party this afternoon.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep. So Kyle, are you as excited as I'm sure millions of other Americans are for the Super Bowl? Because I know that you're not necessarily like a sports person, although you do like esports and like video games.
Show my nerdiness there. No, I frankly, I haven't paid any attention to the Super Bowl this year. I used to be more avid and like a more avid person to pay attention to like the NFL and the NBA. NBA was usually my main sport because I played basketball. Mm-hmm. But yeah, honestly, until last night, I didn't even know who was playing in the Super Bowl. I'm finding this as a good opportunity to just kind of hang out with some friends. But yeah, no, have you?
I'm excited, but I'm excited because I get excited about the Super Bowl Sunday. A lot of times because my team's playing, but I also like just
he's a Pats fan.
I'm a Patriots fan. I am.
Crucify him.
Yeah, you outed me. But honestly, we were actually talking about this yesterday, just kind of with our group of friends. I mean, the Super Bowl Sunday has kind of become like a cultural holiday for the United States. And it really is. A lot of people use it as an opportunity to get families together and friends together and, share food and share,
it's kind of like a
celebration.
It's kind of like a second Thanksgiving, right?
Yeah.
Where you kind of get everybody together. But it's usually more, it's like a way to bring friends together, even people that don't pay attention to sports very much.
But it's interesting, and it's interesting that it's evolved into that. And I don't know. I think that and it's like, I get why some people don't like football or don't like sports or whatever, but I don't think that you can take away. I don't think people can deny that having kind of a something that our entire culture experiences together is a bad thing. I think that's a really good thing.
Yeah, no, I would never say there's anything wrong with getting involved or getting super hyped about football or any other sport.
Yeah.
I do think that there's often a kind of and maybe this just is me. I do think that there's often kind of a religious mentality that people have with their teams that's kind of interesting. And I've never really partook in being yes, this is my team, this is who I support. And I think I enjoy it. I enjoy sports mostly just because there's that team element, and it's just one team going against another team, and it's just a battle of who's best at a given time. That's interesting. And what I like about football in particular is just the strategies that are in play. I don't subscribe to any particular team necessarily.
It doesn't get you in the field.
Yeah, so when the Super Bowl comes around, I have no real attachment to any of these teams.
Okay.
And that's really why it's just it's just another football game to me.
Do you have attachment to the to the day though, and kind of the celebration?
I enjoy getting together with people. It's usually a time, but often the Super Bowl is not even necessarily about the game. It's just about us getting together.
Exactly.
Right? Everybody getting drinks and just having a good time.
Yeah.
It's just you have it's giving you an excuse to get everybody together.
Exactly. I really think, and this is something that Kyle and I had both talked about would be, maybe something that would be a topic of today's podcast, is this idea that I think a lot of people, modern people, and a lot of times that's just younger folks, really discount holidays and a lot of the kind of cultural, institutional, celebrations and just kind of traditions that we have historically had. And, I think that there's something wrong with that because it does provide a lot of value to a lot of people.
Yeah, and that's something, and it might be for a podcast that we have on the back burner that we'll be getting put together or getting uploaded soon, where we ended up talking about the differences in our personalities.
Yeah.
I think that this is often kind of a major difference between the two of us. Is like you're very much usually about the social cohesion and bringing everybody together and that type of a thing, and that might be why my brain is a little bit less on the tradition side. Like these a lot of the times like Christmas is a time that you get people together. Thanksgiving is a time that you get people together. But like in my head, it's just like, you know, it's just another day of the year. Like we could do that. We could do that at any time.
So you think
like that's kind of where my brain usually focuses in on. It's not like there's nothing special in particular about like any one day. Is like you should always have a spirit of giving with your friends and family. You should always have like you shouldn't just be getting it up to date with your family on Thanksgiving. Like that's
right.
Like
well, that's true.
Usually where I'm at, right?
That's interesting. I don't know. I used to feel that way. I guess when I was like in high school, I was like, well, this is just like any other day, you know, that sort of thing. But I think as I've gotten older, I definitely understand a lot more of the value, at least from my perspective, of holidays. And I think that like it goes beyond just like the spirit of giving. It's like this act where everybody goes through it the same time in a lot the same way, and
kind of like amplifies it because everybody's doing it at the same time.
Well, I think it makes it sacred. It injects a level of sacredness into the holiday where people you know meet that with reverence, and they feel like it's a special thing.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Maybe
I
that's
think
what
that
it is.
What that does is it goes beyond just like, you know, saying that this is just like something everybody should do. It makes it like sacred and like something that needs to be revered. So that really passes along cultural values more so than just saying, oh yeah, this is just something, you know, be nice and you know, those sort of things.
Yeah, I guess in my brain, like I feel like I don't necessarily need those things, but probably on a societal level, those are probably very useful when it comes to it, because it's just like it gives everybody this kind of commonality, this like and that's very cohesive, that everybody's kind of on the same page with each other.
Exactly. So I read about some of what I'm drawing from here. I actually read a really interesting. There's like it's like a couple thousand word you know, analysis that one of my favorite websites. I go to the Art of Manliness. You ever read that?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So for our readers,
I don't read it often, but yeah,
okay.
I know what you're talking about.
Well, I highly recommend it for our viewers. But the Art of Manliness is awesome, and the guy who you know runs the blog, he did an amazing analysis of why, you know, in his view, we need to bring back rituals into kind of the modern American life. And you know, his whole take on it was like, okay, well, if you have a party, what makes parties special? So like if I throw a party and everyone just like gets together, brings their own beer and has fun, that's great. But what if you imbued that party with like a sense of ritualism? And so you have like a special thing that you all do together, or you do it on the same time every year or something like that. That stuff then turns just a get together or a social gathering into something that like everybody can, you know, participate in, and there's like rules, and I don't know.
Well, yeah, because when you think about like say you're part of like, you know, just like in your town, like your town will have like a Founders Day event or something like that, or like you know, like this thing that's very unique to your town, and it's kind of like, okay, we all have this common interest because we all live together in a geographical like area. Or if like you're part of like a fraternity or something like that, you have kind of these almost like ritualistic practices. No, that makes sense to me. Yeah, it's just my brain just doesn't necessarily think that way, which is kind of a weird thing to me. But also, that is kind of something that we were wanting to talk about, was like, because Kendall and I are both political people. This podcast in general is going to be often about like current events and politics and stuff like that. And something we were talking about at breakfast this morning before we started doing this was we were talking about how oftentimes like a lot of political people will be kind of outside a lot of like cultural things that are happening, because we're so like dipped in like wonky policy stuff. And we often, and especially people that are like, you know, like we're both libertarians, and there's often that stereotype of libertarians that we can be very autistic in the way that we think about things, where we're very like, no, this is all we're talking about. And it's like, we need to give a little bit more credence to the cultural events that are happening around society.
and the value that they have in political discourse.
Yes,
particularly if you're
completely.
coming at it from a political point of view. The,
Well,
the value of
yeah.
cultural institutions and how those play upon people's political beliefs.
Well, and that was kind of the big thing, because like right now we're in kind of a weird era with the whole Trump everything, and
Yeah.
pretty much everyone is talking about Trump all the time and all that stuff. And it's just like, it's not necessarily like a lot of these events that happened, not necessarily all of them have to do with like economic policy and taxation and all this stuff that we're so used to talking about in the political sphere. Like really what's happening right now is much more of like a cultural phenomenon where there's like
Right.
almost a culture war that exists. Like it's not like a real war, but there's like different opposing cultural values that are all
Yeah.
attacking one another.
Well, I think a lot of people. I think it's been played out a lot in national media and that sort of thing. Just this big divide between rural America and kind of like the coastal urban cultures. And there in like the Trump dynamic, I think a lot of people play it off as like well educated, kind of elite people versus like farmers and working class people. But kind of like you were talking about earlier today at breakfast, it's a lot more complex than that. And I think that it's important when we're thinking about politics to remember that there's a lot of cultural dynamics at play, and it's not one side versus the other, because culture doesn't work like that. There's a lot of different intersections. Explain for our viewers what you were talking about with the Bernie Sanders people and how there's a lot of intersections with them and Trump and with libertarians, stuff like that.
Well, yeah, because so something that I've been thinking about a lot lately is like people and we have probably a lot more familiarity with like conservatives and libertarianism and that dynamic and that kind of those groups of people just from our past experiences. Well, but like often people on the conservative right will pretty much just lump everyone that they don't like as like the progressive left.
Yeah.
And they're just like all one entity, and like these
Right.
people, these like the kind of like the managers of society, the people that are kind of like the elite mindset, like they'll just be like say like the Mitt Romney types or something like that. Like people like the Tea Party would go against, like the John
Yeah.
McCain's, the Mitt Romneys. They'll just be like, oh, they're just closet progressives. Like, and
The
it's just
Tea
like
Party criticizes them in that way?
yeah,
Okay.
in that way. They're just like closet progressives, and they're all on one team, really.
Right. That's a line I've heard a lot.
Yeah, and that's but like you also have it like with the Bernie Sanders like people, and we're seeing this dynamic playing out in real time with the way that the media is treating Bernie Sanders, Tulsi Gabbard, Andrew Yang as like the primary people that I have in mind, and like often those types of supporters, which are kind of like the more radical elements of the left, in the same way that like the Tea Party and libertarians are kind of like the radical elements of the right.
Right.
You have them being like, no, like all those like the Hillary Clintons, the Obamas, like them, they'll just be like, oh, they're kind of just like closet corporate conservatives, and they just lump everybody in with like all together.
Because they're still thinking of it on a left-right dynamic.
Yeah,
so
but
they're like, if people aren't as far left as we are, then they're right wing.
Yeah, exactly. Because and it's just because like they're about Medicare for old and poor rather than Medicare for all. So like that means
Yeah.
that they're basically conservatives. They're just like these corporatists.
And
like,
it goes both ways too.
Yeah.
The Tea Party and kind of the farther right factions, the folks that they view like the neocons and the John McCain's and the Mitt Romneys, the more moderate voices, they just say, well, they're just rhinos. They're just Republicans in name only.
Yeah, they're Republicans in name only, and then but they're basically, they might as well just be Democrats, because
Right.
like we just lump in the great evil altogether with
Right.
them.
And so I think your point though, Kyle, was really interesting, because it was saying that it's not, culture doesn't run on this
On
left,
this right versus left, yeah.
Exactly. There's so many different intersections, and I think it's really important. I agree with you, Kyle. I think it's really important for anybody who wants to engage in our political process to understand that there's a lot more cultural dynamics at play than just like on the scale of left to right, So I guess explain, like, if I'm looking at the Democratic primary that's coming up, I, from a right-wing perspective, what should I be aware of when I'm looking at that? Because I think that it's easy to say, oh, they're all just socialists, but what's the...
Well, yeah, because I think kind of in my mind, and this is just the way that my brain works, is I'm much more concerned in a lot of way of like those managerial types that I mentioned. Like the people that are really just trying to like manage society and like the establishment, quote unquote, like the like that
that's what when you hear that term thrown around.
Yeah,
that's
that term.
what you're referring to.
I'm talking about like the managerial.
People who are in power.
Not. It's kind of like a mindset about how to use power and like like a philosophy of power. I think a lot of these people have. There's a great book on it from a guy who says that this is a very important thing for society, which I disagree with. James Burnham, he wrote the book called The Machiavellians and also The Managerial Revolution. He talks about this stuff, which is like, it's like these people that are the protectors of freedom is what he calls it. He says like they're like a necessary protector of freedom, is that they don't really have any real ideologies, and they just kind of they'll just jump between these ideologies as a method of being able to kind of control their side of things.
They're kind of like the
they're the institutional power brokers. They're the professors in the universities. They're the corporate press. They're the politicians. They're all these people that are kind of like yeah, they have that mindset where they're very non-ideological in that manner. But like so like and they're seeing it because like they're trying to like kind of keep societal cohesion together with their kind of control on things, and they see like say the Donald Trumps, the Ron Pauls, like those people that are
the populists,
as like they're not very controllable on the right side. So like when you have the media that has like everybody talks about like right like the left bias in media, where it's just like Fox News and then there's everybody else,
right?
But what it comes down to, and what we're seeing with the Democratic primary, is that it's not just right versus left on the media, like fake news, quote unquote, cycle of things. Like they're doing the same thing to Tulsi, Bernie, and Yang. And why is that? Is because they're not part of this like managerial mindset necessarily. Like they have their own ideology that's more difficult to
pin down.
Yeah, to pin down in the like
they're a threat to the establishment.
Yeah, they're a threat to the status quo.
Okay.
In the same way that like both of us grew up with like the Ron Paul revolution, it's like the Bernie Sanders phenomenon is a very similar phenomenon. It's just, and he points out a lot of the same things that I think we would point out of like a lot of problems in society. That he just has radically different solutions than we would have. But he's still pointing out those problems.
Yeah, and I think that was something that was really important for our viewers, you know, kind of listening here and wondering, you know, how should they kind of include cultural awareness into their kind of like political assessments and things like that. I think that's a really, really good point that you bring up because, you know, the populist movements, it's not like they're coming from completely different sides of the coin. I mean, they really are pointing at a lot of the same stuff. So, like you were talking about the Occupy, a good example is the Occupy Wall Street movement back in the day was happening around the same time that the Tea Party movement was happening, but they were pointing at very similar illnesses in society, I guess. But they just came at it from
different angles,
different kind of cultural viewpoints, and they arrived at or they advocated for different solutions to those ills.
Well, it's like the Occupy people would say that's why we need more regulation to come in on the banks and stuff like that. Well, our side of things would be like, well, government regulation is kind of what caused these problems,
right?
But like we're both pointing out the same thing, is that there's this corporate government influence that is existing that's completely destroying our monetary policy. So like different approaches, but it's also that it's still that kind of like, it's almost like a class warfare, to sound like a Marxist, I guess. It's kind of like a us versus them mentality that exists. It's just the us has a lot of different views on how to actually deal with these solution with these problems.
Yeah. Well, so I think that, you know, if you're a political observer and you're saying, wow, I can't understand at all, you know, these Bernie Sanders people or these Elizabeth Warren people, and I can't identify with them at all because I'm right wing, or vice versa. You know, if you're left wing looking right wing, I think it's important to step back and say, okay, but what are the problems that they're pointing out? Are they the same problems that I'm concerned with? And that, I think, is the grounds for building kind of commonality, and then maybe we can move towards solutions that we all agree on.
Yeah, well, solutions I think are still going to be a major battle in a lot of these elements. But I think, just one of the most interesting aspects of this Trump era that we live in is just kind of how that facade that exists, like a lot of these institutions that we've kind of been trained almost to just accepting, like the colleges, the corporate press, all this stuff. Kind of like that's kind of like the red pill phenomenon. Like that's right. Like that's kind of what that's all about. Is like people are kind of seeing past that now and just kind of realizing like, you know, maybe some of these things aren't exactly right. Like, and people will have different...
The prevailing wisdom.
Yeah, the prevailing wisdom, as they would call it. But, and me, somebody has a perspective, is like, a lot of people think that just 2016 happened, and then all of this stuff just started going crazy. It's like, no, they've always been like this. Like, the corporate press has always been lying about things. It wasn't just because Trump was in office that now, that's kind of like a common, like, conservatives will often have that mentality of, like, oh, like as soon as Trump came in, it's just like the corporate press was just like crazy bad. Or it's like, or like when Obama came in, it's just like all of a sudden like there's just this left-wing bias in the news. I don't know what's going on. Right. It's like that's not really how things happen. Like people have been lying about these things all the time. There was a reporter back in the day when the Soviet Union was going on, when we started getting what is this? I'm blanking on what his name was, but like when things about the gulags were coming out, and all that stuff. He was just talking about like, oh yeah, any mention in the news about gulags and all that stuff is just CIA propaganda.
Oh, and, really?
Yeah, he's just like that. This is just anti-Soviet propaganda.
This was like in the 80s, I guess.
Yeah, somewhere around there. Yeah. Okay. The Marxist experiment is doing just fine. Like it's just like this is the type of things that we were having all the time. Like these types of things like are not new to all of this.
Right.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. You know, so I don't know, when I've the biggest frustration for me, I guess, in politics isn't necessarily that you know, the issues that I care about aren't being solved in the way that I would like or something like that based upon my political leanings, but it's that I think that people are so factionalized that they have a hard time even getting to a place where they can see that there is some commonality between parties.
Often, yeah. Well, especially like you know, for instance, like take an issue like criminal justice reform or something like that. There's a lot of people on the right and a lot of people on the left that really agree with that.
Yeah.
And another element, and kind of like a big thing on the differences between the right and left, but really where they have a lot of common ground is like, remember the Bundy Ranch situation where there was
in Oregon or the standoff?
No, Bundy Ranch was Nevada.
Oh, okay.
Because it was like Harry Reid's area, I think I remember.
Right.
Where there was like a standoff with the BLM, and that's basically like it's the people versus the state. Like that's what's happening here. And then I think you see like the same type of elements where the things that those people were concerned about is really the same types of things that like Black Lives Matter is concerned about, because it's like us versus the cops. It's like the same type of element of like over intrusion of government, like the enforcement arm of the government,
right?
And like it played out in different ways, but these people hate each other because of like race dynamics in the country, but really they're fighting against like the same people. It's just like, because people are just factionalized into all these different groups, it's just like nobody's like talking about like, no, we actually have common interests. Like we think that the government is overreaching in this aspect of our society, and like these people are like, we think the government's overreaching in this aspect of the society.
Right.
But then they're like, but we hate each other.
Right.
It's like it's dumb. Something
that I thought was really interesting that Kyle has talked about in the past is this idea that culture is kind of a bridge for a lot of these differences. And you know, obviously we're all, you know, America is the classic like melting pot. There's a lot of different cultures in our country, but you know, one of the things that we kind of wanted to cover coming into this podcast that we thought would be interesting is the need for engaging in kind of cultural outlets. So a podcast like this, or you know, TV and art and music and different expressive forms of expressing, I guess, your values and things like that. In Kyle's analysis, which I think is really interesting, that kind of bridges, if I'm understanding it right, it kind of bridges under cultural understanding a little bit, because people can consume, you know, a song or something like that and enjoy it on its face value and understand a little bit more about your culture from the lyrics and that sort of thing, and then maybe they're a little more open to what you believe.
Yeah, and something. So, Kendall and I were kind of talking about this earlier, but I've been reading a lot of Camus, the French absurdist, lately. And there was a line in one of his books that I remember reading that stuck out with me, where he was talking about I don't remember what the quote is, but it was like something to do with like, yeah, he had a chapter about fiction and philosophy together, and he basically had a quote of like, nonfiction really doesn't do much to actually change people's minds. Like, and
so
that
if
was
I,
kind of the conclusion.
if you
he
and I
came down to.
disagreed about how to, if you and I disagreed about the minimum wage, it's probably not very effective for me to like give you an economics book.
Yes,
and say,
like Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson. This will teach you everything.
Yeah,
it's like it might work for some people, but I think
Right.
like on a mass scale, it's much more useful to like take maybe like the Ayn Rand approach, where you're writing fictional works that inspire great characters with certain ideals that you want to portray, that you think are like important cultural values. And that's something that I think is missing in a lot of political discussion these days, is like nobody's doing that type of thing. Like nobody's doing that with like I shouldn't say nobody, there are people doing it, but like I think a lot of like policy wonks like us, where we will get kind of wrapped up into, it's just like, well, if we just educate people on like we just get them to learn some Austrian economics, everything will be great. But it's just like no, like most people
don't care.
Most people aren't concerned about that. Most people are concerned about kind of the things that they're seeing just directly in front of them on like a very cultural level, and how like certain cultural values are changing. And some people will cheer on those cultural values changing, and other people will be like, no, this is what I hate, and this is why I'm going to vote for X person. Like,
well, and I think that I really think that underscores the need for, at least I've seen this in a lot of political people, where they believe in a free society that values individuals, and that upholds this idea of mutually beneficial exchanges and trade, and being tolerant of other people and that sort of thing. And then you have a lot of people who hold those political beliefs that don't embody it at all in their personal life. And so I think that's something that's huge, and that kind of starts on the individual level of changing culture. But I mean, if you truly believe in advancing those political ideals, starting just embracing those values in your personal life and showing yourself off as an example, for other people to kind of draw off of. Because I think that if you live by example, then people can go to you and say, or they can look at you and say, well, hey, that's a great person. They're very nice. They do all this stuff. They do a lot of good things. Maybe there's something to that.
Yeah, well, and I think this is something that the two of us and some of our like libertarian-minded friends, when it comes to government and philosophy of government, have been really talking about lately a lot over the last like 2 or 3 years. Is we've been very much like because like libertarianism is like a legal and economic philosophy. It's like how to deal with like laws and stuff like that, and like the nature of government. But like it's based in ideas of individualism and like creating strong individuals that are like and it's like something that is often missing in a lot of these conversations amongst political people is instilling those values that you think would be great for society to run, and like actually creating great individuals. Like if you're going to create philosophical movements, political movements, is like you need people that are actually like walking the walk. Like, exactly.
How do you like I think the example we were talking about earlier on when we were having this kind of preliminary conversation was the political philosophy of libertarianism hasn't yet really had an answer of like how to be a good parent, or how to be a good family member or something like that. And we think that those are questions that we need to answer if we're really going to build kind of a cultural consensus around these ideas.
Well, yeah, and kind of something that kind of spurred on us wanting to do this, talking about this topic was I'm a huge listener of the podcast called Part of the Problem with Dave Smith, and there was something in a recent episode from him that stuck with me, because he was getting a lot of blowback for saying, he made a point that like one of the biggest changes that have happened in our society in the last 100 years is that parents are no longer really parenting their children. They export those duties onto a nanny, onto schools, onto all that stuff, and like schools are valuable for teaching kids and stuff like that. But
kids are going to school earlier and earlier.
Yeah, and like this is a huge change in the history of civilization. Like not just in America in the last 100 years. So like and like he was just talking about this, and he had a bunch of blowback online for talking about this because he's a libertarian. He has a libertarian podcast, and is like a bunch of libertarians coming in was libertarianism has nothing to say. Like, it's you do you, man. Like, and that's kind of like a mentality that I think it's like kind of a dangerous mentality, not to talk about these like cultural values on like, you know, how should we parent children? How should we, like, it's not like we shouldn't just get bogged down in only talking about like, oh, should the state mandate this?
Yeah,
like
that's
there's more to life than just what the state does.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I completely agree.
And we often get trapped in that mindset of being like, oh, the big boogeyman, the state.
Right.
Like, it was like, yeah, like we have problems with the state and policies and stuff like that, but like the state isn't part of every aspect of life. There's more to life than that.
Yeah. Well, and also too, I mean, you can uphold the like moral ideal of like, you know, non-aggression and that sort of thing as far as the libertarian philosophy is concerned of governance, but you can still be a jerk.
Well, and
you know?
And to be clear, because I mean, we're still new to this podcasting thing, we should explain what non-aggression is.
Sure.
Like, yeah, like a core tenet of like libertarian principles is what's called the non-aggression principle, which is just basically the idea that you should not enact violence against non-violent people. Like, you should never use violence against somebody that is acting peacefully. Yeah. And that is kind of a core built-in part of like our moral
principle
system.
of a lot of libertarians kind of
but
that's how they
also
formulate it.
that is kind of the golden rule. Like, that's the common like golden rule.
It is
that's
the golden rule.
that is
exactly.
That is how most people operate in their day-to-day life. It's like, this isn't that unique of a concept.
Exactly.
It's just libertarians have kind of
they apply it
it
to the government. That's the only difference.
It's just libertarians apply that to government.
Yeah. No, but it's I don't know. I think it's really interesting because we absolutely do need to have these conversations, and we need to build out these conversations in a way that are expressive and culturally based, rather than just dry and talking about politics. You know.
Exactly.
That's a really interesting thing that I hopefully a lot of people who are starting to get involved in politics, you know, maybe they're a little older and they're watching the news more and that sort of thing. Hopefully they can avoid kind of the populist right versus left dynamic that a lot of other people have fell into, and rise above it and really just view people as people, and look to meet with agreement rather than focusing on your disagreements.
Yeah, it's like, because really we all have more in common than we don't.
Exactly.
It's just like we're living in this like polarized time where we have to just be like, oh, that person disagrees with me on X issues, so like therefore they're the devil. Like,
yeah.
And it's like we're way more common than not.
Well,
and we're also doing way better historically than ever before.
We're very
like,
prosperous.
Things are doing really well right now.
Well, so something I was going to say is really, I think it plays into your point, and somebody that both Kyle and I, you know, for our viewers, we really think is very inspirational, and I've definitely read his book and watched a lot of his lectures online, Jordan Peterson. And one of the interesting things that Jordan Peterson has said that I think is pretty relevant here is this idea that for so long, for like the last half century, you know, since the 60s, we focused on freedoms and rights, and you know, freedom to act and all this kind of stuff. And that's been great because freedoms and rights are very, very important. But what Jordan Peterson says is that there's what also accompanies that is this idea of, now that you have freedom, now you have responsibility to act appropriately and to be a good person and all this stuff. And I think that that's the side of the equation that we as a society, and especially American society, we have got to embrace and focus on.
Yeah. Well, because and that's so much of our political dialogue right now is on, like, you have the right towards this thing.
Right.
Like you have the right to healthcare, you have the right to whatever. Like, you don't have the right to do this. The government doesn't have the right to do this on you.
But that leaves a lot of young people who are entering this world saying, okay, but I know I'm free to do all this stuff, but how should I act? What's good, what's bad? And
like, they have no sense of meaning because
Exactly.
they have no sort of like responsibility in their life.
Yeah.
Everything's just kind of like it's very wishy-washy. Like, our society's become like very culturally very wishy-washy on that.
And
subject.
I sound like a 50-year-old boomer when I say or
Boomer Kendall over here.
But I'm like, yeah. it's if anything goes, that's kind of the message, right? Like their message is that anything goes, anything's okay. You have the freedom to do anything you want and or be whoever you want to be. And the 50-year-old or the 60-year-old boomer in me is saying, no, you don't. There's things that you can do that are really dumb, and there's things that you can do that are really smart. And you ought to live and act like that's the case.
Yeah, there are often things that on average are going to be like objectively better than another thing. And they're going to be better for you, give you more fulfillment.
And not only better for you, but better for your family,
the people around you.
Better for your people, your friends, and society.
Well, and typically, if something's better for the people around you, that's going to be better for you because you're maintaining good relationships with people.
Exactly.
Like you're seen as somebody that is helpful towards your little clique of friends or group of friends or whatever.
So circling back to our kind of talk about cultural institutions and holidays and the Super Bowl and all this kind of stuff. I mean, that's where I think the message is there, because a lot of the younger folks who are coming into this world with this complete message of total freedom, anything goes or whatever, nothing really matters, you can do whatever you want. They say, oh well, holidays and the sacredness of like cultural institutions like that doesn't matter. And it's like, no, it actually does, because these things show us how to act well, and it provides structure to our life and provides meaning.
Well, and also, because like I think this is a problem that plagues a lot of people of generally our political beliefs. And I had this conversation with a prominent person in politics. I'm not going to mention the name, but like in our libertarian kind of belief system on how government works, like often people of our mindset will get bogged down into this is like you should experiment with the ways that you live and stuff like that, which is like actually probably a useful thing.
Openness.
But it's also just like, there comes to be kind of this extra little tidbit that comes on that idea where it's like, you should never judge people on the way you live. And often a lot of like people in our libertarian world get bogged down into this just let that person do whatever they want, which I mean, like I never believe that the government should probably get involved in what people are doing. Like I'm for legalizing drugs and stuff like that. But
that's not to say that being a heroin addict is a desirable
is a desirable thing to have. Like as a member of your community, a member of like your friend group, like if your friend is going down what you think is a dangerous path, it is, I think, a noble thing to help guide them in a sense. It's just, I don't believe somebody who is going down a bad path should be thrown in a cage. Like there's a very different type of view there. Is like, and I think a lot of people will just be like, oh, if you're just going to, become a heroin addict and you're going to do all these dangerous things or like societally life changing things that kind of get in the way, like we should be allowed to judge that, like especially amongst our friends, like, and we should be able to have our opinions on that. We shouldn't just be like, yeah, you do you, man, like, because like I'm sure it'll work out fine. And I think that there's often that mindset that kind of plagues like the libertarian view sometimes.
No, I 100% agree, but honestly it plagues a lot of our public discourse right now, because we have this idea that like,
I think it happens a lot on the left too. We're seeing a lot of that type of stuff on the left.
Exactly, because we have this idea in the free speech debate space where it's this idea of like, well, if this someone is somebody I disagree with and they're speaking online, there's a lot of people in this country right now who say that those folks should be censored and deplatformed, and these people with wrong opinions shouldn't be allowed to speak. And that's not how you should solve conflicts as like neighbors and friends. So why would it be okay to solve conflicts on a broad scale through censorship? I don't think that makes any sense.
Well, it just stifles creativity.
Yeah,
like all the most innovative things in society, all the most creative ideas that come out of society are usually the things that happen on the fringe. Like they're the things that are a little uncomfortable, but like whenever new innovation comes up, whether it be through technology or philosophy or whatever, it's always an uncomfortable time. Like when cars came around, it was a very uncomfortable time
for the carriages.
like like that's something that we have to kind of come to realize, and like all these things kind of have the same logic follows this is
Right.
like if you're just going to start stifling speech is like one thing, a lot of those things are just going to be driven underground, which who knows what could happen with ideologies that get driven into a place where they just build up resentment and start hating everybody because no one will let them talk. But like if there are bad ideologies out there, we should let people see them so that
Let's
people
air.
can make a judgment on those ideologies.
Let's air our differences
Yeah.
here. See, I tend to think I'm tending to think about things a lot more in in like a broken down context. So it's like, okay, you know, if we have this broad problem where there are, you know, people who are, you know, disruptive and they have these ideologies are very dangerous in my opinion or whatever. It's like, okay, well, how would I solve this situation if it was like, you know, my family member and we're all living in the same house and they were, you know, saying something that I fundamentally disagree with and I think is dangerous for the family? How would I solve that situation? Would I lock them in their room and say, you know, or gag them and just say, you can't speak anymore? You know, that's not how you would constructively solve something in a family dynamic.
That's how you create a serial killer.
Yeah, that's how you create
That's
yeah.
how you- like-
Exactly. Versus, you know, how you would appropriately solve that. I think most people would say that you'd say, hey, let's have a family meeting. Let's air out our differences here. Let's see if we can come to an agreement or at least understand each other.
Or also,
I think that works on the broad scale too.
also take an assumption that person might know something that you don't know. Also, like
yeah,
like,
exactly.
there can also be that element of something of like you might feel very uncomfortable with a topic, but maybe there's something to what they're saying that you haven't looked at. You haven't, because like we're all operating in the world and we all know, like we don't all know the same facts.
Yeah.
Some people have everybody has different life experiences from each other. Like everybody's read different books. Everybody like
Different
like
upbringings.
nobody knows everything about everything. So
Right.
like we should all kind of assume, and I think this is a useful thing about diversity and like cultures coming together and trading with each other, is that sometimes like a culture might not have all the answers, and there might be some things that another culture does have, and we can evaluate those in the public square
Exactly.
through peaceful dialogue and kind of come to conclusions about, you know, what one thing is that's better, what might we
Exactly.
be doing that's worse that maybe we can adapt on. Like it'd be like, say, like a society that approves of slavery is freely trading with a society that does not approve of slavery, and like we should be able to come together and have a conversation instead of just like killing each other and calling each other names, being like, you know, maybe the slavery thing isn't a great thing, like maybe,
Yeah.
and here's my arguments, and I'll present my arguments to like why the slavery is not a good thing. Yeah, it's just like we need to be able to have that open and peaceful dialogue with each other to be able to kind of.
Funny
get
enough,
for-
in your
for-
example, in your example with the slavery thing, that's how like 90% of previously slave approving countries reformed. Is they had like a dialogue, and they decided that culturally this is not something we can morally this is not something we can support. I think
America
was-
had a civil war,
Exactly.
But like, but you have William Wilberforce that did amazing work
Exactly.
and spent his entire lifetime like fighting against slavery up
Yeah.
in the UK.
And I think it wouldn't have been possible without like the exposure to the evils of slavery. If you're a completely isolated country that never, you know, you just don't have that broad exposure to something maybe that you would feel morally opposed to, then how do you make the case against it, you know?
Well, and you also got to realize, like, there have been philosophers debating the ethics of slavery for hundreds of years prior to all these decisions being made. Like, these were things that took some time, but eventually we got to the point where it became culturally unacceptable to, like, enslave people that you conquered or based on race or whatever all these things were. Like, a lot of these cultural dynamics do take time.
Yeah.
But like they often will resolve themselves. We're becoming better and better as a society throughout history. Like, we're not killing each other in the streets anymore like we used to be. Like,
Yeah. Well, no, that's why I think it's really, you know, from a political perspective, I actually kind of welcome the idea that there are a lot more folks on the left who are embracing kind of a cohesive ideology of socialism, even though I think socialism is
Dangerous.
inherently dangerous. It is you know, obviously something that I am fundamentally opposed to, but I think it's great that they're they're able to come out in the public space and say and be more accepted as far as like having a public dialogue around the ideas of socialism,
rather than just going McCarthyism and just like locking people up.
And so now I can actually engage with those people, and they're out in the open about their beliefs. I don't have to. There's no doubt about what they actually believe, and then I can engage them in an intellectual way and say, well, you think this, and I think this, and this is our disagreements. Versus, I think people need to avoid the kind of like the intuitive way of going about it, of just saying like, shut down the socialists, don't let them talk, just like you were saying with McCarthyism, lock them all up just because it's a dangerous ideology. It's like, no, let's just engage them peacefully and have this battle of ideas, and maybe we'll all learn something.
Something that I think, and this is kind of shifting to politics and the capitalism versus socialism thing, something that I do think would be interesting if Bernie Sanders does get the nomination, which we'll see. We'll see. There's a lot of shenanigans going on with the DNC right now. We might end up having riots at that convention over this. But if we ended up having, because like Trump, although not a perfect capitalist by any means, is kind of representative of quote unquote capitalism, and Bernie Sanders, also not a perfect socialist by any means,
right?
Does represent quote unquote socialism. It would be interesting, like if that's the case, like maybe this is the time where we finally have that dialogue of like capitalism versus socialism.
But I think
in 2020.
Well, I think that's a hopeful viewpoint.
It's hopeful.
It's
hopeful. It's interesting.
But I don't think we're there, because I think the reason why we're not there is because we're not there as a culture, right? Like we're those are two populist movements, and populist movements don't have intellectual dialogue with each other. That's just valid. Not something that happens. Like we were talking about at the beginning of this podcast, populism means that everybody views it along a right-left spectrum, and your team blue or your team red or your team socialism versus team everybody else, and that's a dangerous way to go about things. I think that we need to engage with people we disagree with and not label them and not put them into a box, and try and suss out our differences and actually find things that we agree on and then move forward, So
yeah, I might be getting hopeful, which is, it's usually you that's being hopeful on things. But maybe
isn't that weird?
Maybe I'm being a little hopeful on that. Yeah. But I do think it would be an interesting dynamic. Like it might not, it wouldn't happen necessarily on the campaign trail, but I think it would be like some of the more intellectual types, like the scholars behind both sides, that would be kind of having that dialogue.
The political science mindset, I think, would say that I don't think we've ever seen when the country has been polarized, like polarized with partisanship, where you've had a wide disparity between Republicans and Democrats, say, or two parties. I don't think we've ever seen broad cultural consensus derived from that.
Yeah,
I think where we've seen broad cultural consensus and a lot of like actual intellectual academic dialogue is when we've had parties really close together. So say like in the 50s and 60s, there wasn't a big difference between Republicans and Democrats at that point, and we actually had a pretty rigorous debate of capitalism versus communism, and we had I think a really rigorous public debate that resulted in the rise of Barry Goldwater and Ronald Reagan, and kind of this cultural consensus around like capitalism and
privatization, free markets. Those were a lot of conversations back then.
Yeah, and I think that's
even though Reagan wasn't actually like a perfect champion in those things, but like he did kind of represent those in a lot of people's minds.
Represented it culturally. Yeah. So I think that really, we're never going to get anywhere when we're in a hyper-polarized partisan environment that is especially driven by populism. Those two sides at this point kind of being the Trump populism versus the Bernie Sanders kind of AOC, like socialist populism. We're never going to have a productive dialogue with that. We need to work past these this kind of time period, and I think we're going to get to a time period where we have a lot more less ideological, less like partisan leaders who are able to actually engage in debate.
Yeah, and also something that might be kind of hopeful too is it's very possible and probably more likely that after Trump is out of office, everything kind of just goes back to the status quo that everything was in before?
Well, I think that's a really interesting question. That's going to be for like a whole nother podcast.
Yeah, that'd be a whole nother conversation.
But yeah, I think that's the big question people ought to be asking themselves is that is Trump somebody who is a regime changer where he came in and now nothing's the same? Or is he somebody who basically was kind of a fluke and he was able to shake things up, but then it's just going to go back to
I go back and forth. I go back and forth on that question all the time.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are going back and forth on that because I don't know what the future Republican Party looks like after Trump.
That's one of my biggest questions: is what does the Republican Party look like after it? And also, depending on what happens this year in the Democratic Party, what is the Democratic Party going to end up looking like?
Because it sure as heck is not going to look like Hillary Clinton.
Yeah, I don't like I don't know what a lot of these people that are kind of like the middle of the road is kind of not right to describe them, but like those like corporate Democrats, those social corporate Democrats, and like the neoconservative types. Like I don't, because like the neoconservatives are all just like all anti-Trump, and like they're basically siding with the Dems on everything. But then you also have like all this backlash coming from the AOCs, the Bernies. Like AOC had a quote of like recently where she was saying like, why am I in the same political party as Joe Biden? Yeah, like you're gonna have these elements. Is like, I wonder what is going to happen with all these things.
Well, my personal opinion is I do think this is part of a transformation.
I think that we're in a transformation of some sort.
And we're just at we're at one time slice of it. But I think if we fast forward 20 years, what we're going to see is that all of a sudden the kind of separation that we're seeing with everybody is going to basically turn around, and there's just going to be different institutions and different managers, like you were talking about in the beginning of this, and different kind of institutional players, and then there will be young people like we are who are saying, damn you system, and who knows what that system's going to look like, but it's going to come out of everything that we're going through right now.
Well, and I think because and as we're kind of wrapping this thing up too, I think one of the biggest things when it came to this cultural dynamic and what people actually care about, and I think one of the reasons why Trump is president right now is everything was played out in the viral video that went out with CNN on Don Lemon's show. And like I think that showed everything that was happening right now, where you have kind of these elite people like that are they're in their fancy corporate press jobs and stuff like that really showed how they look down on various aspects of society in that clip. Editing Kyle will play that clip because we don't have the means in our current setup. And so it'll be playing right now.
Of course, he's just trying to demean her, and obviously it's false. And look, he also knows deep in his heart that Donald Trump couldn't find Ukraine on a map if you had the letter U and a picture of an actual physical crane next to it. He knows that this is, an administration defined by ignorance of the world. And so that's partly him playing to their base and playing to their audience, the credulous boomer Rube demo that backs Donald Trump, that wants to think that Donald Trump's a smart one and y'all elitists are dumb.
You elitists with your geography and your maps and your spelling, even though
your math and your reading.
Yeah, you're reading, your geography, knowing other countries, sipping your latte.
All those lines on the map.
Only them elitists know where Ukraine is. Sorry, I apologize.
But by the way, Ukraine? Oh my God!
But you know what? But it was Rick's fault. I blame Rick. But in all honesty,
blame
you know what
Rick.
NPR should
Why
do?
not? Sorry, hold on. Wait.
Can I tell you
Give me
what?
a second. Hold on. Sorry. That was good. Sorry, Rick. That was a good one. I needed that.
I think it showed a huge dynamic between just kind of how these different people feel about each other. And really, because when you think about it, like what Trump ran on is like, he ran on making America great again. He ran on like the border wall, but he mostly he mostly ran about how like these people are corrupt, they're not for you, they're not helping you, They're doing everything wrong, and these people hate you. And it played out with the Hillary Clinton deplorables quote, right? Which basically everything that happened on the Don Lemon show was the it was the same thing as like those irredeemable deplorables.
Exactly. And so it's like, okay, if you actually want to make something happen and advance your beliefs in society today, the worst thing you can do is play into this populist partisanship and say, oh, everybody who's not on my team is an idiot or not smart or they haven't done their homework or whatever. It's like, that's just not true. There's a lot of smart people on every side. You know?
Well, and something that was super interesting about that, did you see Don Lemon's apology video the next day?
No, I did not.
So, because
we should play that too.
Yeah, if I find it, I'll play it here.
Personally important to me to address this, okay? Ask anyone who knows me. They'll tell you. I don't believe in belittling people, belittling anyone for who they are, for what they believe, or where they're from. During an interview on Saturday night, one of my guests said something that made me laugh. And while in the moment, I found that joke humorous. And I didn't catch everything that was said. Just to make this perfectly clear, I was laughing at the joke and not at any group of people.
I feel like a real YouTuber now.
Yeah.
No, what he ended up saying was, like, he basically came on and was just like, I was just laughing at the joke. I wasn't laughing at any people or any group of people. I would never laugh at any group of people.
Interesting.
It was like that type of thing.
I didn't
But you're
know
just
that.
like, but like, you know, back in the day where the corporate press was where all news came from, and you didn't have people just sending out viral YouTube clips to people all over the place. It was like that probably would have passed. But now we're at a point where just like, no, I saw what you said. Like millions of people beyond your regular audience saw what you said.
Right.
And it's like, you are so disingenuous in this apology right now. It's like you and two other of your pundits were just sitting there laughing about these people and calling them dumb because like they might, like, because they probably can't find Ukraine on a map. Is like,
exactly.
Is like,
so if you, I guess the message is, if you find yourself acting like they were in that video from your couch when you're watching the news, or from your, you know, your office when you're scrolling through Twitter or something like that, think again and try and reform your viewpoint there, because that's how we're really going to work through things in our country.
Yeah, there's no dialogue that's happening. It's just like these people literally just look down their noses on, like, you know, like I think they were talking about like miners or something like that. Is like they were very specific on the group, I think. But it's just like, yeah, okay, like these people have a different lifestyle than you. They know a lot more about mining than you do. So like their job isn't necessarily to find Ukraine on a map. But is that how you define intelligence?
Yeah.
Is geography?
From
like, that's
from
not
an elitist
like,
standpoint. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like I know geography better than these people. It's like that's not a sure sign of intelligence either.
Exactly.
Like it's just like it's nonsensical, but it's just like, yeah, well, our team's better. Like we know better than the proles of society.
And
like,
and everyone's guilty of it at some point. I've definitely been guilty of it in the past. I know, Kyle's been guilty of it, I'm sure you'd say.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And it's just something that we have to work through and be mindful of. So, you know, hopefully on Super Bowl Sunday, as everyone's coming together and enjoying some beer and football, we can think about not our differences, but our similarities.
If you're on one team, don't hate your friend for being on the other team.
Exactly.
Make it playful. You don't have to lose friends over today.
Exactly.
From your views.
Yep.
Is there anything before we close this out? Is there any last things that we should get into?
I don't think so, man. I think we've had a good conversation. It's kind of fun for a one-off video that we just decided to do kind of on a whim for Super Bowl Sunday while we were both in town.
Yeah.
But appreciate anybody who has input into what we were talking about here. Would love to see your comments and suggestions for new topics. You know, we want this to be dialogue, not just, you know, Kyle and I talking, even though we have fun doing that.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, engage with us. Leave a comment about what you thought about what we said, and maybe we can continue the conversation in our next podcast.
Oh, and also, and we also have another episode that is just sitting on the back burner right now. I've been out of my place, so I haven't been able to upload things super well. But we have another one that's going to be also that we'll probably be putting out sometime soon, or it might be like, kind of like a, if we can't record one week, we'll put it on that week.
Yeah,
it's
we'll
not
just keep
super
it in
topical.
Yeah, that's great.
Where we kind of talk about the origins of why we chose the name Acadian Driftwood for the podcast, some differences between us, and kind of like on a psychological level,
Help the viewers kind of get to know who we are,
get to know us a little bit.
Yeah.
But after this week, we'll be back to being in separate towns and recording via the internet. But with that, I think that we've pretty much gone through everything that we wanted to talk about. So please, if you enjoyed this conversation, share it around. We want to grow this thing. Like, this is technically our second episode, so we're still a tiny podcast.
Like and subscribe.
If
you want to keep updated. We're gonna keep growing this. Obviously, we're in the testing phase, and we're testing it out and seeing how it goes. But we really want to grow this in the future. So subscribing is the best way to keep up to date with everything that we're doing.
Yeah, and we're still working out some quality stuff, and eventually, like right now, we're just primarily doing it on YouTube, but we'll also try to be getting this thing in audio form wherever podcasts are, like iTunes and Stitcher and all these places, Podbean. We'll get this podcast in kind of multiple formats, so for more accessibility to everyone, depending on how they would like to consume this content. But anyways, I think with that, off to the Super Bowl.
All right.
All right.
Thanks, everybody.
Yep. See ya.